Welcome to the Enchanted Archives, where myths, legends, and ancient mysteries come to life. Vampires through history, myths, legends, and real encounters. For centuries, the figure of the vampire has captivated imaginations worldwide. Whether as undead beings cursed to wander the earth, or as symbols of forbidden desires, vampires have appeared across many cultures in various forms. In this video, we'll explore the origins of vampire myths, the evolution of legends, and real-life encounters that have fueled vampire lore throughout history. The vampire myth is deeply rooted in ancient fears surrounding death, disease, and the afterlife. Long before Bram Stoker's Dracula became the definitive vampire tale, cultures around the world believed in creatures that drained life from the living. In ancient Mesopotamian myths, beings like the Lamashtu and Lilitu, early precursors to Lilith, were thought to stalk and feed on infants. Meanwhile, the Strigoi of Romanian folklore were restless spirits or revenants who returned from the dead to prey on their kin. The idea of vampirism often emerged from attempts to explain death and disease. Communities attributed sudden illness or death to malevolent spirits or undead beings, believing that the deceased could return to torment the living. This fear gave rise to practices like burying bodies with iron stakes or decapitating the dead to prevent them from rising again. Though the modern vampire is largely associated with European traditions, creatures resembling vampires appear in many different cultures. Here are just a few examples. Slavic folklore. The Strigoi and Vrikolakas are undead beings known for rising from their graves to drain life from the living. Slavic communities developed rituals to protect against these creatures, including placing garlic in homes and performing elaborate burial rites. Chinese mythology. The Jiangshi, or hopping vampire, is a corpse reanimated by dark energy. These beings suck the life force, or qi, from their victims and can be warded off with mirrors, peachwood, and bells. Filipino folklore. The aswang is a shape-shifting creature that appears human during the day but becomes a monstrous predator at night. The manananggal, a specific type of aswang, separates its upper body and grows wings to hunt for victims. Indian legends. The Vatala is a spirit that haunts cemeteries, sometimes possessing corpses to feed on living souls. The Vatala mythology touches on themes of restless spirits and revenge from the beyond. Greek mythology. Stories of the Lamia describe a beautiful woman cursed to prey on children. She was believed to be a once mortal woman transformed by tragedy into a monster who drinks the blood of her victims. The most influential period in vampire history occurred in 17th and 18th century Europe, when vampire hysteria swept through villages in Eastern Europe. During this time, people believed that corpses could reanimate and bring disease to entire communities. One of the most famous incidents occurred in the Austro-Hungarian Empire during the 1700s. Villagers exhumed the body of a man named Peter Plagojewicz, claiming that he had returned from the grave to feed on them. His body was found unnaturally well preserved, with blood at his mouth, fueling fears that he was a vampire. In response, locals drove a stake through his heart and burned his corpse, a practice repeated in other documented cases. The New England vampire panic in the United States during the 19th century followed similar patterns. Families believed that deceased loved ones, like the infamous Mercy Brown, were responsible for spreading illness. To prevent further death, Mercy's body was exhumed and her heart was removed and burned. The vampire evolved from a malevolent spirit of folklore into a sophisticated character of Gothic literature in the 19th century. One of the earliest literary appearances of a vampire was in John Polidori's 1819 novella, The Vampire. Polidori's vampire, Lord Ruthven, was a charismatic and aristocratic figure, setting the template for future depictions. However, it was Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula that solidified many of the conventions we now associate with vampires, such as their aversion to sunlight, their need for blood, and their ability to mesmerize victims. Dracula was both a terrifying monster and a seducer, blending Victorian anxieties about sexuality, disease, and immigration into one unforgettable character. The vampire legend continued to evolve in the 20th and 21st centuries, particularly through film and television. Early films. In 1922, the silent German film Nosferatu introduced the world to a more monstrous depiction of the vampire. Count Orlok, with his grotesque appearance, stood in stark contrast to the suave aristocrat of Stoker's Dracula. The film set a precedent for horror cinema and remains an influential work in the genre. Hollywood vampires. The 1931 release of Dracula, starring Bela Lugosi, cemented the vampire's place in popular culture. Lugosi's portrayal introduced the image of the vampire as a dark, sophisticated figure dressed in a black cape, a look that would define the character for decades. Romantic vampires. The 1970s and 80s saw a shift in how vampires were portrayed. Anne Rice's The Vampire Chronicles reimagined vampires as tragic romantic figures. Her characters, such as Lestat de Lioncourt, struggle with immortality, loneliness, and love, influencing many modern vampire narratives. Teen dramas and fantasy. Vampires became part of youth culture with shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer and The Vampire Diaries. These stories presented vampires as both monsters and complex characters capable of love and redemption. The Twilight Saga. Stephenie Meyer's Twilight series brought vampires to the forefront of popular culture in the 2000s. Her portrayal of vampires as beautiful, sparkling beings added a new layer to the myth, shifting the focus toward romance and personal growth. While many vampire stories are rooted in folklore, some people throughout history claim to have encountered real vampires. Here are a few examples. The Highgate Vampire, 1970s. In Highgate Cemetery, London, rumors spread about a vampire haunting the graveyard. Two self-proclaimed vampire hunters, Sean Manchester and David Farrant, conducted investigations, adding to the hysteria with their sensational claims. The incident captivated the media and became part of urban legend. Modern vampire communities. In recent years, individuals identifying as real vampires have emerged in subcultures worldwide. Some people claim to experience a need to feed on energy or small amounts of blood to maintain their health. These communities often have rules and rituals surrounding consent and safety. Medical explanations. Some researchers believe that real-world diseases like porphyria and rabies may have contributed to vampire myths. Porphyria, for instance, causes sensitivity to sunlight, leading sufferers to avoid daylight. Rabies, which can cause aggression and hypersensitivity, may also have inspired stories of vampirism. Why do vampires remain so popular across cultures and generations? The answer lies in their versatility as symbols. Vampires can represent fear of the unknown, the struggle between good and evil, or even the desire for eternal youth. As our understanding of life and death evolves, so too does the vampire myth, adapting to fit the concerns of each new era. Whether portrayed as cursed beings driven by hunger or as romantic figures searching for redemption, vampires continue to fascinate and frighten. They allow us to explore themes of immortality, identity, power, and morality, all while reflecting our deepest fears and desires. The vampire is one of the most enduring creatures in myth and fiction. From ancient Mesopotamian spirits to Gothic literature and modern television dramas, vampires have evolved to reflect the fears and fantasies of the societies that created them. Whether viewed as terrifying monsters or tragic anti-heroes, vampires offer a compelling lens through which we can examine our own humanity. The next time you watch a vampire film or read a vampire novel, consider the long history that has shaped these creatures, and remember that within every story of darkness lies a reflection of the human condition.